Oh hey there, boss babes. Didn't see you there. Today we're going to be discussing one of my personal favorite classics, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, one of the only English authors that I actually will tolerate. We're going to really dig into this feminist, not so low-key, queer, anti-war, anti-imperialist, brought to you by a bougie woman allegedly just trying to buy flowers for her awesome party. We seem to be in a little bit of an era of confused gender expression. The dichotomy of slut-shaming and ultra-sex positivity, the I'm not like other girls, or their counterpart, the ultra-feminative basic bitches, the catgirl anarcho-communists, and then the fascist sympathetic wolf girls. And much of these dichotomies and questions that might arise around gender expression seem to kind of be rooted in a question of whether these are actually empowering or whether they serve the same purpose of pleasuring the male gaze. And in truth, not to get ahead of ourselves here, I think it's kind of both. I mean, Billie Eilish finding empowerment in her full erotic moment that she's having, and Cardi B reclaiming this kind of stripper status in this ultra-feminine way, can definitely be seen as taking the power back from this kind of sexualized patriarchal gaze. But at the same time, those Vogue cover shoots or giant performances, when posted to the public, are inherently going to be over-sexualized by a lot of dudes and anyone else, you know? And that can all feel very paradoxical in a way that I think also influences how then we tend to understand how we express our own gender. And when expression is something that is kind of an extension of yourself, a type of performance that is meant to represent your own identity and character, that means that what you're expressing is inherently vulnerable to the judgment of onlookers and, you know, the revaluement by others. And in Mrs. Dalloway, published all the way back in 1921, Virginia Woolf really grapples with similar questions about gender expression, and she uses the images and aesthetics of flowers and botanics to reflect the multifaceted ways in which women can often be objectified, and the actual constraint that feminine expression, or what we deem as feminine expression, has on a woman's own freedom. In Woolf's case, she's showing how, within British society, femininity is constructed by and for men. And throughout the novel, flowers kind of become this symbol for how each character deals and understands their own femininity, and in turn, its relation to beauty, freedom, and
womanly identity.
Whatever that really means. And so by paying attention to the flowers in Mrs. Dalloway, we can better understand how feminine identity can be at once a source of empowerment and also reinforce constraints created by the male gaze to begin with. And I'm learning a little bit too late that I have a trouble pronouncing femininity, so this is gonna go great. Part 1. Mansplaining feminine identity. So obligatory disclaimer here, I am, as you might have noticed, a cis, white, male man, and an American. Ew, I don't think I said that one. And this book, while diving into kind of the complexities of femininity and sexism, is coming from a place of like British high society progressive-ish isms in the 1920s that is very wealthy, very white, like Virginia Woolf herself. And so this video really isn't supposed to be me mansplaining femininity to anyone. I mean, what am I, a TikTok dating guru? And Virginia Woolf's women, like I said, are in no way representative of any kind of universal femininity, if there ever was such a thing, nor is it beyond criticism. Instead, I wanted this to really be more of an exploration of like how our relationships and expression of our own kind of gendered identity are shaped within existing structures of power, and how this novel in particularly shows that with some of my favorite things, like plants. So without further ado,
Hello and welcome to my craft channel. Today we're going to be constructing femininity. Today we're working with the faded elegance that is a dried aster, symbolic here of our aging socialite protagonist herself, Clarissa Dalloway. Why flowers? Well, from the very first sentence of the novel, Woolf's references to flowers reflect the complicated relationship that Mrs. Dalloway has to her own feminine identity in a progressing society. I mean, I'm not here to bullshit you and tell you that 1920s Britain would be totally down and ready for the 2019 Grammy performance of WAP, but it was an era for genuinely progressive politics and social empowerment for women in particular, albeit mostly for rich white women, which Mrs. Dalloway and Virginia Woolf herself are. When we meet Mrs. Dalloway, she's at a crossroads with her internal feminine agency, caught between her expectations as an aging mother and a political wife, rest in peace babe, and the new opportunities being allowed for women in her era. It's in this context that the famous first line, Mrs. Dalloway said that she would buy the flowers herself, takes root in Mrs. Dalloway's own agency. she would buy over her feminized actions flowers. Now, when I wrote the original essay in an English class, I was told that my connection between femininity and flowers was non-existent, so I guess I'll do that here. Flowers are both the literal sexual organs of plants, angiosperms more specifically, and connotatively symbolize a particular feminine romance. I mean, brides hold roses at their weddings, you're supposed to give your partner's mother's flowers. I mean, hell, in literature's most hyped play about a Danish incel, the main character's love interest dies dramatically by falling into a puddle with loads of flowers, a symbol of the lost romance he could have had with her had he been more emotionally and psychologically secure, I guess. And over time, flowers have been feminized, just like how men used to wear all of these dresses and stuff like that in the 1800s, and now it's seen as a very particular feminine characteristic, or rather an extension of feminine identity. With flowers in modern times, we associate them more with both women and the characteristics that women are valued for, like beauty and youth. In a society where women's beauty is generally considered highly important to her character, as, say, her intelligence or wit, a flower makes a pretty useful metaphor, and just as Lorde said on her last studio album, "'Cause all the beautiful girls, they will fade like the roses," a woman reaching middle age is akin to an unwatered houseplant in crisis. Will it just crumble up into an ugly carcass of its former beauty? That's the question. So in this patriarchal society, it might be helpful in understanding what our dude characters think about femininity and the expression thereof, or, for English symbolism's sake, the flowers. Throughout the novel, men evoke recurring imagery of confined and distorted flowers, proposing that femininity in full bloom is only accepted for its beauty, and only allowed within confinement. For instance, our silly boy Peter Walsh, some dude who got friend-zoned by Clarissa Dalloway years away and then decided that he couldn't have her, so he moved to India and snatched her bride there. And I mean, yeah, he's kind of problematic, but he's a 20th century rich English dude, so if you had high expectations, that's kind of on you. Well, on the very same day of the party, he happens to be back in town filing marriage paperwork, relatable content here, folks, and he finds that the city has become significantly more progressive, especially in relation to women having more social liberties in how they dress and express themselves in public. While walking the street of London, he notes, every woman, even the most respectable, had roses blooming under glass. There was design, art, everywhere. A change of some sort had undoubtedly taken place. Here, the newfound social allowances given to women in this early wave of feminism is characterized with the youthful beauty of a rose, yet still detached from liberation as its bloom is confined under the glass. The autonomy represented by a blooming rose is quickly contained, metaphorically showing how many of the women, both in and outside of the text, are allowed respect for the aesthetic feminine expressions, but only to a degree. The women characters and their botanical metaphorical counterparts may be seen as aesthetically and even materially valuable, but not entirely autonomous and quote-unquote valid. If we move beyond visual feminine aesthetics, this kind of empowerment within a glass ceiling can also apply to other aspirations, like her academics and politics. Like OG girl boss Amy from Gone Girl said, the idea of a smart, well-read, cool girl is neato and might even be attractive to these men, but when that intelligence and ambition is applied to an aspiration of real power, and potentially even threatening to the power that the man has, it becomes unattractive and unwomanly. Women and their feminized agency, the roses in this convoluted metaphor, must then be contained intellectually and aesthetically speaking to a range of limited permitted growth and expression. Maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself though. Let's return to the text. When reminiscing about his past love of Mrs. Dalloway, Proto-Incel P even describes his surroundings as being in a walled-in place with rose bushes and giant cauliflower. Here, though Walsh acknowledges the flower's beauty paralleling his ability to admire Mrs. Dalloway for her intellect, the scene and setting is still constrained within literal walls, and indeed, it's clear that this kind of objectification from Peter is in part what pushes Clarissa away from him. Mrs. Dalloway recalls the tense fight with Peter, how they argued. She would marry a prime minister and stand at the top of a staircase, the perfect hostess he called her. She had cried over it in her bedroom. She had the makings of a perfect hostess, he said. Through this imagery, it's clear that Mrs. Dalloway is fearful of being reduced to a mantelpiece object of femininity for her husband to show off, yet never dignified in her own right. Save this tidbit for later. This anxiety of the objectification, which comes in part by the male gaziness of what Peter and the other men in the novel / well, the world have decided is what's allowable for feminine expression and power to be. Perhaps a representation of the male gaze's ultimate influence over why Walsh is unable to truly quote-unquote love Mrs. Dalloway unrequitedly, nor understand her search of her own feminine liberation. Later in the novel, similar imagery is evoked when World War II veteran Septimus Smith— I'm sorry, that's his real name? Sorry, I thought he was a rejected Harry Potter villain. Septimus describes his to-be bride's beauty as being behind a pane of glass, and later, after considering the strain that World War I has had on their emotional engagement with each other, he goes on to equate her newfound tepid femininity to a lily drowned under water. It's clear that Rizia, outgrowing her role as the pretty rose from a village for a soldier to pluck on his move back home, has entered a nebulous state as a caretaker to an emotionally unavailable and deeply troubled husband. In Septimus's case, this change is not only defined defined by the distortion of the original aesthetic expression of the flower and the value he ascribes to her feminine expression, but it also translates to a distanced relationship between the object and the expression itself. The lily goes from a graceful flower to a drowned object. His wife, Rhizia, from the pinnacle of feminized value, beauty that is, to a watered-down husk of wifely caretaker. Through marking a clear separation between a woman's femininity, in this case defined mostly through beauty, and its male onlookers, Woolf draws awareness to the inaccuracy of perception that plagues the men in Mrs. Dalloway. Just as, "But I'm a nice guy, I swear," Peter's perception of effeminate flowers is reduced to a contained aesthetic beauty, his misinformed perception of Clarissa's identity as a woman holds him back from truly connecting with her emotionally. Septimus and Rhezia's relationship parallels this division between effeminate beauty and emotional engagement as well, as Septimus's distorted perception of Rhezia acts as a crux for his own disinterest in her once he's been scarred by the masculinizing experience of war. More on that in the next part. Hence, in this respect, femininity is defined most strongly by its relationship to beauty and is always confined within the looking glass of the masculine gaze. And this is problematic for a host of reasons, right? Equating beauty as the main real value of feminine expression, with knowledge, power, and more being masculine or simply neutral expressions, doesn't create much opportunity for empowerment within femininity and feminine expression itself. Similarly, when the world and people are reduced to outdated understandings of gendered expressions and values, anyone who is perceived as within those boundaries is trapped to the various connotations and stereotypes of that expression. Carmen Maria Machado really digs into this deeper in her 2019 memoir on her experience in a lesbian abusive relationship in the Dream House. Because violence and abusive power isn't something we've conceived to be feminine in nature, people being abused by women, especially other women, are often overlooked and gaslit into believing that their abuse isn't real, or the same if they were to be abused by a male partner, because of these gendered constructions and what actions or characteristics we deem as valuable for each respective gender. So this is the metaphorical context in which we start the novel, following Mrs. Dalloway, a 50-something aging politician's wife, as she embarks on her journey to the flower shop, a literal marketplace of our feminine sexual object.
So whenever you hear flowers, think
femininity as a gendered expression of identity.
You've caught me here in my silly goofy planting mood. So right now I think that our whole metaphor about flowers and botanic imagery and like the way that it is brought up in proximity to our characters needs a little bit more fleshing out. And let's go back to that first sentence. Sorry, I didn't do this earlier. I'm a poor planner. Do you see my Charlie Swan candle? Will this be more of a distraction? I don't know. So Mrs. Dalloway, a woman who is literally aging out of the sexual economy, is starting this novel already by seeking out flowers, which, as we've already discussed, is kind of a feminized marker for youthful value for women. If we do a little pop psychoanalysis here, it's pretty easy to see how her anxiety about aging and what that means for her value as a woman is kind of pressuring her to reassert agency over the feminized characteristics for which she believes to be valuable for herself. In this case, we can already start to draw the connection, perhaps just like Cardi B and Billie Eilish, that Mrs. Dalloway starting the novel to buy the flowers is her in a way trying to reclaim and have a reasserted agency over her own feminine expression and trying to find value within that herself. In a way, this novel starts out to reclaim femininity away from the male gaze. Mrs. Dalloway thus starts the novel believing, or at least hoping, that her own feminine identity has an innate source of power and value, and one which doesn't just come from her being married to a wealthy and politically powerful man. And the question for her then at the start of this novel is whether or not this value is connected inherently to masculinity and men. The objectification of women as botanic objects of male desire is perhaps most clear in Clarissa's semi-emo daughter, Elizabeth, represented by this really sad Christmas cactus. Elizabeth is not like other girls, and she has a little bit of the silver spoon blues. Like, yeah, she's a teenage socialite blooming into womanhood with subtle beauty, but she also has an interest in politics and, get this, cares a little bit about poor people. Unheard of. But again, this is kind of only when she's in a silly, goofy mood. But almost every time that her and her name is brought up, she's being brought up and characterized as some type of different flower.
Instead of, like, I don't know, her actual cares or interests, you know, relatable teen content here.
And metaphorically, this reinforces the depiction of womanhood and, by extension, feminine expression as a part of that youthful flower. While it may seem complimentary in the way that all characters giving compliments think that they're doing good, this reconfines Elizabeth to the bounds of aesthetic beauty as defined by the male gaze, and in this case, her literal suitors. Even Mrs. Dalloway, Elizabeth's own mother, refers to her as being a hyacinth which has no sun, alluding to Elizabeth's newfound seriousness. Mrs. Dalloway's entire critique kind of relies on Elizabeth's somber mood, and her open discussion of things like politics at inappropriate times is a betrayal to her youthful beauty, and thus a betrayal of her femininity. And the flower, representing Elizabeth, has become sickly due to its defeminization, and it's reduced below even an object of desire. This illustrates how the paternalistic male gaze becomes a glass cage beyond femininity itself, and is even seen between women and kin, in which even if one rejects the kind of idea of constructed femininity, one is not free from objectification and degradation. And this kind of concept gets interesting when we look at a character like Miss Kilman, notably Miss, not Mrs. And this is important because Miss Kilman is basically Miss Dalloway's frenemy, emphasis on the enemy part. Miss Kilman is largely portrayed as the antithesis of Mrs. Dalloway, where Mrs. Dalloway has a youthful spirit and is generally observed as being a beautiful and intelligent alongside her high social standing. Miss Kilman is portrayed as a uglier, stout old woman, characterized most by her open rejection of femininity. Mrs. Dalloway takes a clear aim at this, commenting on her balding with age and more masculine presentation, and also her inability to buy pretty clothes, reiterating that Mrs. Dalloway's understanding of femininity and feminine value is enmeshed with both youthful beauty and class. And it's perhaps unsurprising that Miss Kilman is unmarried. I mean, her name is literally Kill Man. You're so subtle, Virginia. How do you do it? And this contrasts well with Mrs. Dalloway, who defines herself so much by her marriage that she thinks of herself as being not even Clarissa anymore, this being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. Tying this all to Flower, our theory starts to gain a little bit more weight when we start to realize that Mrs. Kilman, unlike Mrs. Dalloway, is fairly apathetic towards Flower, which mirrors her apathetic view towards the constructed degrees of feminine expression that they represent. Central to this tension, it's really relevant that Mrs. Dalloway and Miss Kilman understands their own ability to meet a traditional feminine identity as meaning very different things for these two women. Whereas Mrs. Dalloway is enamored throughout the novel by the simple beauty of flowers, Mrs. Kilman actually describes them as commodities of the world, perishable.
Oh, bop, bada bop, boom, pow.
I mean, seriously, Mrs. Kilman identifies the fraudulent perceptions of femininity cast through the male gaze for what it is, a fleeting commodity that's connected to sexual desire far more than actual empowerment, as Mrs. Dalloway is hoping to get out of it. And this difference of understanding in femininity is clear in an earlier confrontation between the two women, in which Elizabeth remembers the awkward encounter when Mrs. Dalloway offered flowers to Miss Kilman, and Miss Kilman
squashed the flowers all in a bunch and hadn't any small talk, and what interested Miss Kilman bored her mother.
The constructed object of femininity that Mrs. Dalloway holds so closely to her own self-identity and understanding of herself, an affluent socialite politician's wife, is disinteresting to Miss Kilman, in part because she's never been granted the same kind of shallow feminine respectability due to her low class and her inability to meet social expectations of feminized beauty. And though I've kind of been presenting Miss Kilman as being this, like, modern feminist who does not care about the male gaze, Miss Kilman's own distancing from her own femininity is linked to her trying to get closer to masculinity in this constructed binary of gendered expression and presentation, and she still isn't particularly empowered in her own identity. No matter how close she tries to get to this masculine gendered expression, she's never actually able to attain the structural privileges that benefit the men in the novel. In this way, Woolf is really able to demonstrate how even those who are able to express themselves beyond the characteristics of traditional femininity do more to criticize the constructability of feminine expression than actually become empowered by any kind of proximity to masculinity. So I mean, what about masculinity? And this is the part of the video where I make this feminist novel about men. Okay, so thus far we've been able to see how the women in the novel relate and understand their own femininity, and I think it's time to see how the men in the novel interact with femininity or flowers beyond just the ways in which they conceptualize it, like we did in part 1. Septimus Smith, the emotionally dissonant and mentally ill World War I vet, is largely understood to be a foil to Mrs. Dalloway. In true foil fashion, Woolf seems to be interested in how Smith relates to his own gendered expression, masculinity, and how that particularly has been intertwined with violence. Caught in the memories of his past life as a soldier, Smith reflects,
"So prying and insidious were the fingers of the European war. Smashed a plaster cast in Creys, plowed a hole in the geranium beds. Septimus was one of the first to volunteer. He went to France to save an England which consisted almost entirely of Shakespeare's plays and Miss Isabel Pole in a green dress walking in a square. There in the trenches, the change which Mr. Brewer desired when he advised football was produced instantly. He developed manliness."
Not only is violence then an expression of masculinity through its strength and control, but by being violent itself is a way to develop masculine identity. For men to develop a legitimized, empowering masculine identity, they must destroy geranium beds and lay conquest to these objects of femininity. And I mean, in 2021, and especially in an American context, I don't find this incredibly hard to conceptualize, right? I think what's interesting about this novel is that Virginia Woolf really explores how this can be really destructive to the men's own sense of self and mental health. When Septimus describes the end of the war and the death of his best friend, but also maybe his lover, it's kind of unclear. It's not filled with triumphant camaraderie, but a bleak return to the normal world.
He had gone through the whole show: friendship, European war, death, had won promotion, was still under 30, and was bound to survive. He was right there. The last shells missed him. He watched them explode with indifference. When peace came, he was in Milan, billeted in the house of an innkeeper with a courtyard, flowers in tub, little tables in the open, daughters making hats, and to Lizaria, the younger daughter, he became engaged one evening when the panic was on him that he could not feel.
Here, his coming of age and his coming of manhood has been weaponized by the state to win a war. This in turn has created a very disinterested Septimus who doesn't really know how to act with the women and the flowers in his life. In this way, the state can be understood as this kind of domineering, colonizing masculine force, one which espouses violence with indifference to feminized spaces and bodies, represented here by the flowers. And thus, England, the state, is framed by its violence, which in turn assimilates a violent masculine identity to the young soldiers and men of the country. So when concepts of beauty and peace have been feminized, this not only engages women in restrictive degrees of how they can express their personhood, but it also produces a depressing and destructive construction of what masculinity can be. And especially when that violence is no longer needed or tolerated, one can feel a sort of worthlessness and lack of direction. There's a scene pretty early on in the novel that exhibits this pretty well with Septimus. In this case, Septimus and his wife Frisia are walking through the streets of London, and she suggests,
"For you should see the Milan Gardens," she said aloud. But to whom? There was nobody. Her words faded. So a rocket fades. Its sparks, having grazed their way into the night, surrender to it. Dark descends, pours over the outlines of houses and tours. Bleak hillsides soften and fall in.
Septimus is literally unable to interact beyond his wrecked understanding of a post-war world. Is this cute? Is this good? It's like the more dramatic blackpilling of 19th century English men who've just come back from the worst war they've ever seen in history. Think the cringy American flag, Punisher, Joker-loving phase that teenage boys have and hopefully grow out of. They're seen as legitimized way to become men and everything that masculinity is valid for, this duty to defend and protect through legitimized violence. But the effects of this, again, can be really tragic. Frisia and Septimus' marriage is totally loveless, and all of this is punctuated, of course, by Septimus' sudden suicide later that day. And when ideating on his own suicide, I find it interesting that he describes it like this.
He lay very high on the back of the world. The earth thrilled beneath him. Red flowers grew through his flesh. Their still leaves rustled by his head. This boy's elegy is played among the traffic, thought Septimus. Now he withdraws up into the snows and roses hang about him. The thick red roses which grow on my bedroom wall, he reminds himself.
His confrontation with the finality of his life allows him to imagine himself beyond this masculine soldier identity, one in which he can literally become composed and have these feminized characteristics like beauty, which he sees as unattainable in his current state and understanding of his identity. So in summary, gendered identity and expression can be kind of damaging to everyone when it comes to being solely constrictive and inflexible. And flowers are very pretty. Bam. This video, done. Well, okay, not really, because like I said earlier, I'm kind of a whore for Woolf's melodrama, and there's one glaring character that we really haven't been able to dissect in terms of their relationship to flowers and femininity, and that's Mrs. Dalloway herself.
Okay, so let's reset the scene here. It's clear from the early beginnings of the novel that Miss Dalloway really wants to be appreciated for her more feminine characteristics like beauty or pleasantness. But she also really wants to break free from that kind of objectifying force of the male gaze. I mean, that's like part of the reason why the whole novel starts in the beginning. She's not introduced as Clarissa, but as Mrs. Dalloway, an acceptable and feminized version of someone with actual legitimate power, right? But she's still going out of her way to get the flowers for her party. Mrs. Dalloway clearly wants to have agency over her own feminine expression, and she even potentially believes that femininity can be empowering within itself. So when she actually arrives at the flower shop, she instantly becomes obsessed with the flowers, their feminine characteristics, and the soothing effect they have at actually generating peace internally within her.
Biologically speaking, the flower itself is a hermaphroditic organ, so it's not like inherently feminine the way we typically talk about it being, but
I'm talking about books, so I'm going to argue soothing peace, akin to the imagery of Septimus's roses growing through him after death, and that it's due to something that's innately feminine in characteristics, and in deep contrast to what we see of the stress and violence of masculinity in the novel. And I mean, just look at how Woolf describes the flowers there. She writes at length about the colorful beauty of the flowers. At one point, describing the flowers almost divinely as
glowing, white, violet, red, deep orange. Every flower seems to burn by itself, softly, purely in the misty beds.
The very atmosphere of the flower shop and that intense feminized environment, particularly with the flowers, evokes a really emotional and serene response from Mrs. Dalloway, where she wonders,
more and more gently, as if this beauty, this scent, this color, and Miss Pym liking her, trusting her, were a wave which she let flow over her and surmount that hatred, that monster, surmount it all, and it lifted her up and up.
I mean, these descriptions of the flower's natural beauty are borderline religious, and it's Mrs. Dalloway's spiritual response to the flower shop that implores the idea that she's kind of undergoing some kind of gendered euphoria in such a feminized, peaceful space. And unlike Miss Kilman, who sees femininity as a weakness, Mrs. Dalloway understands her femininity as a potential source of raw power, especially when it's not defined or occupied by men or traditional masculine expressions of power. And it's on that note that this entire scene gets violently interrupted by a fancy car that she assumes to be holding someone in the monarchy, in the British monarchy, that loudly violates Miss Dalloway's white feminist flower power hour. That's a lot. And unless I've done a really bad job at reading, I mean, there's always that possibility, it's actually pretty unclear as to whether she even buys flowers or not for the party. And I mean, not to gaslight gatekeep girl boss, but Mrs. Dalloway said she'd buy the flowers herself, but I don't think anyone's really checking in to see if she actually did it. There is a different character, though, that we haven't talked about yet that did end up buying some flowers that day. Get ready for the drama. I don't know. This is what happens when I try not drinking alcohol for these videos. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Mr. Dalloway and how he's kind of an incompetent English boy who never learned how to adequately describe his feelings. So, you know, most men. He's like this rich, conservative-ish, used to be progressive politician kind of, or whatever. It's not really that important. And he doesn't really matter that much in the novel, more than just like what he symbolizes.
Objectification now comes in man form.
Man form.
You're done. You're done.
Like, if Pete Davidson is kind of like the guy version of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, then Richard Dalloway is kind of like a khaki, emotionally unavailable suitcase. In the novel, on this day, for the party, he goes out to lunch with his bros, and he's basically like, OMG, I really feel like I need to show my wife how much I love her, but I can't just say that or show that in any emotional way. And so, what does little Richie do? He gets her flowers. Sure, fine, whatever. And that's his own way of saying, I love you to her, without actually, you know, saying the words, I love and appreciate you. Just buy her an object. It's much easier. And I mean, to be perfectly fair, he does have these really sweet intentions, if not a little bit tone deaf. But it's okay because, like, a sentence later, Woolf calls him simple by nature, so he's a simp and not a great partner. Anyway, so, dun dun dun, later that day, still before the party, the silly goose Richard goes up to Miss Dalloway and, well, this mess happens.
He was holding out flowers, roses, red and white roses, but he could not bring himself to say he loved her, not in so many words. But how lovely, she said, taking his flowers. She understood. She understood without his speaking, his Clarissa. She put them in vases on the mantelpiece.
Okay, so now at first, this really doesn't seem that bad, but it's also important to take into consideration that this is all from the perspective of Richard and not Clarissa. So what Richard hears her reply is, how lovely that looked. But when we're finally back in her POV, one of her first thoughts is this.
And there is a dignity in people, a solitude, even between husband and wife, a gulf. And that one must respect.
And, I'm sorry, but is that not a red flag? I mean, someone just gives you a token of their love, and the first thing that she starts to think about is solitude. I also think that this scene really mirrors the earlier argument that Mrs. Dalloway had with Peter Walsh, everyone's favorite incel, in which he literally used a representation of domestic femininity, which is like the trophy wife hostess thing, right? And then she feels this kind of like dark sadness within herself. But this is the exact same case of a representation of domestic femininity is being used to objectify and therefore reduce Mrs. Dalloway. And now in this scene, having a literal symbolic representation of what she's feared that she was going to become, shallow commodity of beauty that eventually dies, she's kind of freaking out about it. Like, imagine that you're trying to show someone that you love them, and the gift that you get to symbolize this love actually just triggers them into thinking about everything they've ever hated about themselves. And this is what I love so much about Woolf's writing, how minute moments from your life can kind of organize themselves out of time to inspire these intense emotional responses years later. It's like when you smell the perfume of your first love, but years later, out of context and not with them. And it makes you kind of reflect about how you were as a young lover and how much you've changed since then. In the same way, due largely to Woolf's writing, you really get to share Miss Dalloway's underlying fears with her, that all she'll ever amount to is just a housewife. Flowers on a pedestal to observe and superficially judge. Their foliage in the background, but nothing really of substance. And this insecurity, which reiterates itself throughout the novel, is what causes so much tension between Mrs. Dalloway and the men and women in her life, and also with her own kind of confused and muddled expression of her own gender, because of what was supposed to be a sweet gesture from a husband who just didn't know his wife well enough to understand what his gifts would mean to her. And like, I'm sorry, but this released 100 times the serotonin, the dramatic, climactic emotions in me than that Pride and Prejudice in the Rain scene, okay? Like,
we're good. We're good.
We're good? We're good! Because it doesn't feel fucking good, Greg!
Let's just, can we...
I will not let you do this to me! I will not let go of what is mine!
What am I doing? Ow! Stop pelting! Stop! 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 Security!
and so there we have it, right? I mean, the masculine gaze is struck again. It is both endemic of Mr. Dalloway's inability to communicate his feelings honestly, and it has subsequently reduced Mrs. Dalloway's own character and understanding of her femininity. So by the end of the novel, Miss Dalloway certainly gets her flowers, but instead of being symbolic of her regaining some kind of agency of herself as a woman, they reiterate everything that she was scared of becoming.
Okay, so it's gotten pretty bleak in the novel, and it's now that I'm going to reveal that I've been withholding some pretty important parts of the book in regards to our thesis on feminine performance in flower imagery. Now it's time to talk about the character of Sally Senton, that trust fund Marxist bisexual that you've been obsessed with since your younger teenage years. If Miss Kilman sought empowerment through rejecting her own proximity to femininity, the character of Sally Senton offers an alternative theory of empowerment through the mutilation and reconfiguration of traditional feminine expression. Clarissa meets Sally in her teens as they spend summer with Clarissa's grumpy aunt in the English countryside. During this time, Clarissa seems to be enamored with Sally, with her spontaneous energy and open discussion of political theory, both of which could be considered traditionally masculine traits of the time. Yet, in Mrs. Dalloway's reflections, Sally also embodies youthful womanhood in her own beauty and attire. What, in retrospect, is clearly a young crush, goes to show how Mrs. Dalloway's own queer sexuality is tied not just to Sally's masculinized characteristics, but also to the pieces of femininity that Sally chooses to express. When Mrs. Dalloway recounts the most exquisite moment of her whole life, it is not of the birth of her child or of her marriage day, but of the youthful summer night when Sally stopped, picked a flower, kissed her on the lips. Sally and the young Clarissa's queer sexuality is directly linked here to traditional femininity, the flower, yet it inherently pushes the bounds of traditional feminine expression, a kiss between two girls. Later, Woolf again deploys this metaphorical imagery of the flower and Sally's transformation of traditional femininity, writing, "Sally went out, picked hollyhocks, delilahs, all sorts of flowers that had never been seen together, cut their heads off, and made them swim coming into dinner in the sunset. The effect was extraordinary. Coming into dinner in the sunset, of course Aunt Helena thought it wicked to treat a flower like that." It is the mutilation and reformation of the flower's botanic characteristics which gives the object new beauty, and similarly, it is Sally's own hybrid of feminine expression and unfeminine identity, queerness, unconstrained intellect, nonchalant confidence, which makes her so appealing to Mrs. Dalloway. We're captivated by this character as Mrs. Dalloway is, largely because of how her unique expression of femininity is used to reshape the objectification of woman into something that is empowering because of its femininity. These flowers aren't on a pedestal or representative of a man's admiration. They're transformed to celebrate the things themselves, and Mrs. Dalloway's look back at the moment with awe and a depressing aura of what could have been, which is pretty depressing, all things considered. Okay, this is a side note, but it's also interesting that when Peter reflects on those same scenes from his memory, he remembers the flowers as being pressed between sheets of gray blotting paper with Litaire's dictionary on top, sitting under the lamp after dinner. Aunt Helena was now dead. And, like, Aunt Helena is not actually dead, and so I think it's safe to say that Peter is just wrong about the flowers here, but maybe that just goes to show the difference in how he sees women and femininity compared to the actual women themselves. And although Mrs. Dalloway was definitely impacted by that moment, she really seems to have internalized any kind of transformative feminine identity within herself, unable to actualize her own organic identity. While Miss Dalloway was and continues to be intrigued by the confidence in which Sally reshaped her feminine identity and expresses her feminine queerness beyond that of an object of male attraction, she represses her own sexuality and thus her own inherently feminine feminine identity. Mrs. Dalloway thinks to herself she resented it, had a scruple picked up heaven knows where, or, as she felt, sent by nature, who is invariably wise, when considering the source of her attraction to women. Though not flowers specifically, Woolf uses the imagery of nature to show the internalized conflict Mrs. Dalloway has with expressing her own feminized identity, nature, and how thus she suppresses and resents that part of her identity. This creates a deep isolation within Mrs. Dalloway as her true feminine identity is suppressed for a more traditional one that mirrors her kind of political tamingness after she marries Richard Dalloway. With this knowledge, it makes sense that some of Clarissa Dalloway's more intimate moments in adulthood are when she's left alone, unwatched. For example, when she returns home from the flower shop, with no mention of whether or not she actually purchased any flowers, she's left alone in her piece, and Woolf describes the moment as buds on the tree of life, flowers of darkness they are, she thought, as if some lively roses had bloomed for her eyes only. This imagery, while beautiful, is also tragic in how it parallels Mrs. Dalloway's own suppression of her identity. Mrs. Dalloway's internalized feminized identity is a source of beauty and peace for her, but is cast to darkness, not to be actualized or truly seen by anyone else. Similarly, at the end of the novel, at Mrs. Dalloway's party, she retreats to her garden and got from her flowers a peace which men and women never gave her. Her inability to fulfill the expression of her internal feminine identity has created a life of deep emotional solitude. Woolf also makes clear here that the dual-gendered conceptions of femininity constructed by men and upheld by women are focal to the suppression of Mrs. Dalloway's feminine empowerment. Much like her own walled-in garden, Clarissa Dalloway is actually able to bloom from her own feminized identity, but only within the confines of herself, allowing for temporary peace, but ultimately a lack of freedom that leads her to openly envying Septimus for his suicide. It's like all she needed was a room of her own. And while obviously Virginia Woolf and Clarissa Dalloway are not one-to-one Xeroxes, and I think it'd be disrespectful to both the author and her work to claim this as being a super autobiographical novel, the ways in which Virginia's life parallels Clarissa's is a bit striking. Both born well off in England and socialized in a particularly scholarly and progressive for its time circles of intellectuals with moderately suppressed queer lives, struggling to find their own work and self-value once marrying a quote-unquote nice guy. And though Virginia openly dealt with mental health issues and depression throughout her life, it's eerie when Mrs. Dalloway hears talks of suicide at her party and almost seems envious of the man, who we know to be Septimus. He had killed himself, but how? She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine, never anything more, but he had flung it away. They went on living. They could grow old. A thing there was that mattered, a thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he has preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate, people feeling the impossibility of reaching the center, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart. Rapture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death. And it was tragically 16 years when a troubled Virginia Woolf would fill her pockets with stones and walk into the River Ouse. But that's not how Clarissa's story ends. It's only a few pages later when we get our last true scene with Clarissa. She's monologuing, quite depressingly, about why her life seems to kind of suck, even taking a shot at men. Life is made intolerable. They made life intolerable. Men like that. Yeah, valid. I hear you, honey. In my headcanon, Clarissa leaves to go off and live her cottagecore life in the country with Sally. It's the end of her monologue that I find more interesting, though, and honestly the least melancholic. She's looking out on her terrace gardens and she spots across the way a single older woman getting ready for bed alone, a glimpse into her own potential future. The clock strikes 3 a.m. and she has this kind of epiphany. There, the old lady had put out her light. The whole house was dark now that this was going on. She repeated, and the words came to her, "Fear no more the heat of the sun," an allusion to a song from one of Shakespeare's final plays about the peace in death, or even just the acceptance of death. She must go back to them, but what an extraordinary night. She felt somehow very much like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away when they went on living. The clock was striking, the leaden circles dissolved in the air, but she must go back. She must assemble. She must find Sally and Peter, and she came in from the little room. Then we're transported to the party downstairs where Sally and Peter are catching up, and it turns out that Sally is actually married with 5 boys, so there goes my cottagecore theory, but she does still seem genuinely happier than every other character in the novel, and just as confident as she was when she was younger. I mean, a bisexual queen if you ask me. The final scene of the novel, though, is our tertiary characters thinking and openly discussing Clarissa and what she's made of her life. It's then, mid-conversations between Sally and Peter talking, that we get, "It is Clarissa," he said, "for there she was." And that's it? With people crafting an image of Clarissa and her, well, coming in. Is she coming in to redefine their own image of her after her little epiphany? Or is she there walking down this staircase, the image and embodiment of a perfect hostess, as Peter once described her as? Or, in in my far more campy and dramatic interpretation, in which "for there she was" is so unspecific that it could mean she's thrown herself from the banisters and crashes down the stairs in an act of self-defiance to ruin her own party and image in the minds of all the guests. Okay, well, not actually, but still, like, what if? Though the start of the novel projected empowerment in Mrs. Dalloway's grasp over her own femininity, by the end we're left with a more open-ended and ambiguous picture of Mrs. Dalloway's relationship with her feminine identity, one which might reflect the more complicated relationships we as individuals have with our own gendered expression and sense of identity. The question of whatever happened to Mrs. Dalloway's flower is still largely impressed upon by the male gaze, and it's unclear, much like how Woolf doesn't explain whether this epiphany will allow Miss Dalloway to make peace with herself or to her own self-destruction. This very openness, however, is optimistic in that it indicates that there is an opportunity for internal peace for Mrs. Dalloway to finally embody her own form of femininity. If Mrs. Dalloway sows the seeds of a more genuine expression of her femininity, her queerness, her intellect, she may just be able to reap a life of feminine identity undefined by male dominion or patriarchal socialite society. This whole video really did just boil down to live, laugh, love, Throughout Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf explores the ways that feminine expression and identity is largely constructed through the framing of men. This framing inherently objectifies women as objects of male desire and devalues the empowerment that can be found from femininity within itself. Woolf argues that for women, then, this framing of femininity poses an intense identity crisis, which often leads women to either comply to objectification, as Mrs. Dalloway does, or to reject it altogether in the hopes of achieving some kind of material empowerment in its place, like Miss Kilman. Both the pure rejection and superficial embrace of femininity are ungratifying because they either define themselves in opposition to existing structures or given agency by people beyond their control. True empowerment, however, is shown through a more nuanced expression in which feminine identity is reconfigured in a way that femininity is transformed and still centered, yet not solely defined by its proximity to the wants of men. Hopefully, through this own self-autonomy, all people, men, women, anyone beyond or between, will be able to define their own relationship to their gender expression and performances for themselves. With the scent of empowerment at the party, we are left hoping that Clarissa Dalloway might one day let her roses bloom beyond the garden wall.